Hey, so I wanted to kind of talk today, about, well, I guess we both want to kind of talk today about, you know, cyber kill chain, MITRE ATT&CK Framework, right? Because we hear everyone kind of talking about those, and everyone says, oh, these are the systems that you have to use. These are how, you stop the bad guys, how you understand what they're, doing, how they're attacking. But I think it's really interesting that, you know, these are base systems that a lot of people use, but I feel like everyone uses them kind of different way, right? Like I feel like the way I would use it versus the way you might use it would be two completely different ways.
So that's funny that you say that. So from being in the military and have been doing it for like 20 years, right? Starting out as an IT specialist and then moving into more of a cybersecurity role. Initially or in the beginning, as more of the IT focused mind, a lot of my time was spent, majority of the time, I should say, was spent worrying about what we called STIGs and like NIST framework. I think STIGs were what they are the Security Technical Implementation Guide. And what
Mm.
they are is each piece of equipment in the military had a STIG guide from NIST that tells you exactly what vulnerabilities you had to patch, what settings had to be in a device, and up to their standard of processing, US DoD government data. So in the whole grand scheme of things of like the whole defense in depth strategy, talking about everything from your policies to your equipment to the actual hardware to the operating systems and the things that you employ, such as firewalls and everything else, dealing with STIGs and doing vulnerability assessments and running down all your vulnerabilities and patching them. Initially, early on in my career, we spent a whole lot of time patting ourselves on the back because we were taught to do a specific thing, and that was to pass inspections or to be STIG compliant was a big deal, right? Looking back on that time, reflecting, and then moving forward, almost 20 years forward to today, looking at a couple of different things, that perspective and that vision has changed, right? So in
Mm.
comes the cyber kill chain, which is typically more a strategic view of the cyber adversaries and APTs. And then you get down to granularity, which is where the MITRE ATT&CK framework comes into play. MITRE ATT&CK is more of a living, breathing type of document because it's continuously changing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Whenever your adversarial techniques and tactics are updated or different APTs are using different tooling or something changes, the MITRE ATT&CK matrix reflects that, right? So I think from a defensive perspective, it's extremely important to be able to understand each of those phases and then being able to apply the MITRE ATT&CK framework to the vulnerabilities that you still have that exist, that we won't call them vulnerabilities, or we didn't back in the day, but you're looking at like HTTP port 80, port 443,
Hmm.
you're looking at SMB 445, you're looking at different things that are necessary and leveraged, like Kerberos 88 and stuff like that within a network that are required for everyday activity in the domain to happen. To us, that wasn't an exploit. However, to an adversary or to a penetration tester or a hacker, that's absolutely what those are, because those are the things that they leverage to get in to be able to do damage. So I think understanding it is
Yeah.
definitely a plus.
When you talk about the cyber kill chain, when people talk about it, it's kind of the view of like how is the adversary moving through a system, right? If you're doing incident response, it allows you to kind of look at like what might be the next step that they take, right? What would be, after they do reconnaissance, they do weaponization, right? What's going to be their next step? I think it's interesting, from the incident response, right? The cyber kill chain and understanding the adversary is very much like an active thing, right? It's like, hey, let's see what they might do next, right?
Right. When it comes to, I think it's like a misconception. When it comes to MITRE ATT&CK framework, what people have to understand is those first two, three steps up to the point that they get on target, that takes months. That takes a
Mm-hmm.
lot of time to do all of that research, all of that reconnaissance, coming up with email distribution lists, figuring out exactly what types of of publicly facing web servers you have, what your databases are looking like, different thing that so they can formulate a weaponization plan, right? Because they have
Yeah.
to find the CVEs to exploit to get on target as well. And I think it's anticlimactic to say, like, the actual hacking part of it, like being, like I said earlier in my career, being down there and being part of defensive cyber operations and then flipping it and getting to see the offensive side operations side of the house, the actual time that they spend actually doing the cool guy stuff you see in the movies on
Yeah.
keyboard hacking something, that's very anticlimactic because it happens in like 34, maybe 30 minutes or so, then it's
Hmm.
over. And then they're either on target or they've moved on and trying to figure out other ways to get in, right? So I think that that's what's misconceiving about that, is that those two, the first 2 to 3 steps are all about the preparation and planning to be able to get you onto target. And then once you're on target, then that's a totally different ball game because different APTs utilize and leverage different things differently, especially within, because each environment's a little bit different too. So they like to say, they like to live off the land, so to speak. So they're
Hmm.
using native command lines, syntax. You're using WMI. You're using, different PowerShell commands. You're using what you can find within the environment to continue to pivot and move around to either improve or, compromise more systems and or to, move in and accomplish a specific objective. But I just thought I might highlight that, is that, yeah, the whole reconnaissance weaponization, that takes months and months and months, probably years to be able to put together, depending upon the target, I imagine too, of what you're trying to accomplish there.
I think from like that takes months, but I think it's interesting from like the cyber threat intel perspective, right? When I look at like reconnaissance weaponization, like I'm looking after the fact of like maybe who they were, what they've done, right? I might try and take what they've done and compress that uh, really, into a short timeline, right? So like reconnaissance, if I want to know like why they targeted a company, I might start doing OSINT on that company, right? Like what does that company do? What is that organization doing? Where might they have like started that target, right? To kind of see if I can figure out that path that they're taking, right? So then you kind of get that picture, right? Like who they email, why they email, what was that phishing, link do, right? So things like that to just try and like get into their mind. And then I think for like weaponization, right? One of the things that I do or I might do is looking at Malware Bazaar, right? Like what is out there? Is there a sample of like their weapon that they chose, right? Is there a sample that they threw out there so that I can get that sample, kind of run it through sandboxes and then throw it to someone like you and be like, "Hey, I don't understand what this thing is doing. It's running all these stuff. You're like the malware analyst. Can you tell me what it's doing?" And then I put it into like, words for non-techie people. I think it's interesting. Like when I look at like, the cyber kill chain and like MITRE, right? Well, MITRE I guess is a little different. And I'll talk about that later. But when I look at it, I'm looking at it as like, can I kind of replicate or find those steps after the fact of what that person did, so that can help me build that kind of perspective of who they are, right? So I can understand some of the TTPs they use to possibly develop threat profiles or do attribution, right? So I might use open source tools. I might look at like I might do analysis of their phishing, or one of the things that I've done is look at the analysis, after their delivery, right? If it's been a phishing, like kind of look at like the language they've used, right? See if we've seen that before. So I think it's interesting that like there's like kind of the really technical part of the cyber kill chain, right? Which is how many months did it take them? Like what were the tools that they were building and developing, and how did they put that code together? And then there's like the cyber threat intel part, which is like, yeah, we want to understand that, but we also want to understand what they did, how they replicated their actions, see if we could build that threat profile and not just like respond to their malware or their ransomware or whatever they sent. So I think that's kind of interesting how there's a difference in use, but like I try and, one is like understanding that it's months between that reconnaissance weaponization, right? What are they building? Do they already have the system? But like for me, it's like, all right, how can I shrink that and get an answer as quickly as possible?
You talked about Malware Bazaar. You talked about Virus Total, some of the other some of the other tooling for defensive cyber operations. But what people have to understand too is a lot of those things exist for the offensive cyber operations side of the house as well. So like, for instance, like when they're doing their weaponization, or you're looking at a target, and the complexities of today's today's IT infrastructure is designed to put plenty of roadblocks in place. So when it comes to an exploit and or a hack, it typically involves what they call exploit chaining, or payload delivery chaining, is where you're going to need more than one exploit in order to actually get on target, right? And a lot of this stuff can be done for free. You have Exploit DB is out there that has a whole catalog of different exploits for different CVEs. And then you have, as well as Exploit DB, you have GitHub. GitHub is a huge resource today to find a whole bunch of different exploits and just code that keeps getting reused over and over again. There's also some paid for services. So I know one time we did a white paper and we looked at a couple of these different companies out here. They got like, I think it's a broker called Zerodium or something like that. Zerodium. And they offer services anywhere from the range of 100,000 all the way up to, it's like $2 million for a 0 day. They give the vulnerability assessment of what they're looking for and the target that they're going to go after. And then these guys craft together reliable, 0-click, just flawless exploits to be able to get them on target. And so anytime you're talking about a 0 day, like I said, those are big deals because that hasn't been made public to the world yet. So the probability of that working is 100% out of 100%, right?
As much as from the defender perspective, we sit here and we use open source tools and paid for tools to figure out how the attacker is attacking. The attacker uses those as well to figure out how to attack, right? Everyone's using the same databases and open source tools to try and figure out how you can attack. And I think that's really interesting that the difference between the attacker and the defender is just when and how you're using those tools, right? Like I'll look at a CVE list and say, all right, let's look at what CVE exists for whatever this system that I'm looking at is, right? And I'll look into that. I'll see what the system is. But an attacker is going to look at that CVE list and say, all right, what are the vulnerabilities that exist for this system for me to try and attack? And then they'll go to Exploit DB, or they'll use the tool that you were talking about, or Cobalt Strike, right? They'll use these pre-developed tools that they're paying for to kind of launch these attacks using these CVEs. So we could both turn into bad guys if we wanted to, because we know the tools in the databases to become bad guys, but it's our morals that keep us the good guys versus the bad guys who are using the same systems for bad purposes.
That, and I'm allergic to prison, but what you're hitting on is exactly true, and it's also a mindset difference as well. So that's why typically when it comes to a defender, your attack surface is so broad, right? Because the purpose of your organization is to communicate and collaborate with other organizations to either make money, to get out your message. For academia, it's to teach students, and the massive amounts of people that share data on a daily basis is it's just what is communication, period, that allows or enables organizations to be successful. And when we start talking about that and going down that vein, that's why a lot of these things have to turn. Like the mindset has to turn. And I'm by no means the de facto expert on hacking and penetration testing or anything like that. But since I've been with people who do this for a living, and that's something to do, you start to develop and pick up on there. It's just a different mindset altogether, which is extremely useful as a defender, because you get into some of the nuances and of what they're thinking and why they're thinking that way, or what typically works in the Windows environment that doesn't work in Linux environments. It's like different nuances about each and every operational environment is different as well. And I think that with having that knowledge, like I said, every single defender should find themselves a pen tester and put them in their hip pocket and ask questions and be able to have that interaction. Because if you don't have that interaction on your network, you're relying on other tools that are signature based to be able to give you an idea that something is wrong. Whereas if you see something on a network and you know of offensive tooling, let's say, like you mentioned a couple, right? If I see anything signature on my network for Cobalt Strike, if I see anything on the network that even remotely mentions Mimikatz, any kind of Cain and Abel, you have different PowerShell scripts from PowerShell Empire that are doing different and malicious things on the network that aren't admin related, then, those are different things that give you a leg up as a defender because you're familiar with some of the tooling that occurs on the other side that are typically used in attacks, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where things, if you don't have a pen tester in your hip pocket, right? I think that's where places like, at least from the cyber threat intel perspective, where MITRE comes in handy, right? Because I can sit here and I can look at all the TTPs of an adversary and try and get that picture in my head of, all right, so what are some of the common tools they're using? What are some of the common attack vectors they're using? And so I can build that knowledge in my head of, hey, they're using XYZ, or they're targeting this thing, or they do this exact process. And now in my head, I have that understanding of, okay, well, I don't have that pen tester, but I know that these are bad tools. To be on the lookout for everything, to try and build a threat profile around Cobalt Strike is impossible because everyone uses that, right? But those specialized tools or those specialized steps, right? When you're looking at the TTPs that they're using, when you're looking at, that information from MITRE, you start building that knowledge in your head of like, oh, this TTP means XYZ, or this threat actor might do this in their next step, or the next time they attack, they might go through this process to get there, right? And that's when you kind of start understanding that mindset, right, of where are they going to go. I mean, you look at the pyramid of pain, right? Like TTPs are one of the, like, if you can stop an adversary's TTPs, that's a huge pain for them because they now have to change everything, right? And so getting that perspective, understanding those TTPs, using the tools out there like MITRE to understand those TTPs and build that threat profile allows you to get in that mindset, like you were saying.
The MITRE ATT&CK Framework is a highly, highly detailed, and it's a detail-oriented framework that allows for, I don't even want to guess how many different APTs are captured in the MITRE ATT&CK Framework to go along with thousands of those T codes for all the techniques that are used, right? So it's a lot. And I think that's where, as a defender, you have to leverage some form of automation in order to be able to keep up. And as future versions of AI become available and different learning models are taught, that I think that it'll help out the defenders to be able to quickly assess threats and or breaches that happen and be able to mitigate them in progress versus an IR team like I was a part of many a times where it's already happened, right? Something's already happened and we're coming in to figure out exactly what it is and what took place, through passive means of logging and everything else within the environment to try to figure that out. So from a holistic perspective, yes, MITRE ATT&CK is definitely by far going to be one of the most helpful frameworks out there. And like you said, it could be used for both. I'm quite sure it as a defender, that's our sole companion, to getting after threats and adversaries. So I can only imagine how the offensive side of that, looks at that and views the different techniques as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I wanted to start a threat group, right? If I wanted to, put myself out there as a threat group and try and obfuscate myself, right, where it doesn't show up as me, what's stopping me from just following what another APT does or trying to use some of the similar tools or tools built around them, right? And if I build myself up to follow those exact tools, yeah, I'll probably have some individual, actions that might come back to me, but at the high level, right, people might say, oh, that's APT whatever, or that's this group doing XYZ, right? So by logging every single action that a threat actor does, you could be giving a new threat actor the ability to mimic the actions. And we've seen that before with ransomware groups, right? We've seen this all the time with ransomware groups. Well, like after Conti source code was leaked, how many groups built Conti source code related ransomware and then followed the exact steps that Conti did to get that out there, right? And then everyone's like, is Conti back? Is Conti gone? Like, what's going on with them, right? As much as these tools are useful for us, they do give the attackers a perspective that, hey, this is what I can do to be successful. And I think that's one thing that we have to keep in mind as defenders is, especially from the cyber threat intel, when you're responding to something or when people, you're in the middle of a fight, people are like, who's behind it? Who are you attributing this to? What, we want to know who it is. What country is it? Or who's targeting us? You have to sit back and think, okay, well, I can follow the MITRE framework and I can follow, the cyber kill chain and create this attribution, but I won't know for certain. I don't know if I could give high confidence to this assessment on whether it's this APT or that APT, right? I can do it based on what I know and what I see, but it could be someone mimicking an action of another APT to try and obfuscate themselves and push, information off. I mean, I think we saw some nation states do that to each other, mimic other nation states to try and throw off that scent. I think these tools are really useful from like the attribution perspective, but it's also like, hey, we need to understand that we can't just look at MITRE and go through the MITRE codes and build this attribution and say, well, we know for 100% fact that it is, whatever this group is. Like, we need to sit there and say, no, like MITRE says it's that group. The attribution says that group, but like, until we have 100% confidence, we shouldn't give any attribution.
MITRE does give you the play-by-play, gives you everybody's playbook from what their perspective or what they've observed or what has been observed in the past. And what brings up an interesting point to me is you always talk about these are more, what's the word I want to use? More client side, so to speak, attacks and or hacks, right? Because they're cheaper. You can get a lot of this stuff open source. You can do a lot of things with, I won't say minimal financial effort, because some of the $100,000 is a lot to me, but I guess it's not a lot to a ransomware group when you're ransoming for millions of dollars. But to purchase tooling and things. But some of the things that I look at and that you mentioned that brought up, rang a bell in my mind is, I think it was, I'm not even sure what year it was. I know it was maybe 2015, China. So there's different types of attacks, right? So we have client-side attacks, we have supply chain attacks, and supply chain attacks are a whole lot less frequent and rare because that they are so much more expensive, and it's a barrier to entry because you have to be in somebody's supply chain. I believe it was a super micro motherboards. Super micro motherboards were implanted with malware at a firmware level from the factory in China. Mm-hmm. So I believe China had infiltrated Taiwan, or some sort of China-Taiwan thing was going on, and DoD had purchased thousands of motherboards along with, it was a couple thousand different organizations were found to have purchased these motherboards. And later on down the road, it was found out that these motherboards were implanted with this malware and has been leaking intellectual property and secrets back to China over a span of years. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So I think that those type of attacks, and that's why China is so much more dangerous than everybody else, is that it's always about the long game for them and a campaign plan of, and we're not talking about long game as in 5-10 years. They're generational with theirs. You know what I'm saying? Talking about, what they want to accomplish in 10 years, 15 years, 20-year plans down the road. So I'm just thinking that it's interesting that you say that, because like I said, yeah, these are a lot of what we do is play whack-a-mole with a lot of client-side exploits and things of that nature. But to me, the bigger issue and or a super huge problem is going to be taking closer looks at our supply chain and who we're getting what from, and validating those devices and things. That's exponentially harder to find. If mm-hmm. the motherboard in my computer is compromised, and I power it on, you would never find that, right? That's at a rootkit level. So mm-hmm. I just think that stuff like that is far more dangerous and impactful to national security than, a lot of this client side stuff, because things are going to evolve. Technology evolves every day. Different exploits in different software at different times. The develop is between developers, software developers. You have your cybersecurity folks. It's a layered mitigation technique to attempt to try to secure our organizations. But at the same time, you've lost the battle if your equipment was compromised before you even powered it on. So I think that's a lot of the mindset that's going on right now, especially when you start hearing about, well, you don't hear about it because that's the only one I can in my mind remember that was supply chain related, was the issue with China and Taiwan and super micro motherboards.
I mean, I feel like it's like you said, it's whack-a-mole, right? It's you knock down one person or one group, and the next thing you know, a brand new group pops up, or they move to the next action, and we're just sitting here trying to use the resources we have to be defensive. And I feel like with cyber, unlike some traditional warfare, right? Cyber, I feel like the defensive is always a little bit behind, or always fighting. It always is a bigger hill to fight because you can't see the army massing. You can't see the cyber actor sitting there building the tools, right? You just have to sit there and be ready to respond to it. You can't see the army moving towards you when that army is building itself into the firmware of the system that is being shipped over to the US, right? So, I feel like these tools that we have, going back, like looking at Kill Chain, looking at MITRE, right? They're all useful, but, if we can't see what that adversary is doing, if we can't understand what they're doing or how they're trying to launch these attacks, if we can't get into their, 30-year mindset of how they want to infiltrate the US and get IP and engage in espionage, these tools aren't really that useful. They're more useful for the previous actors or the ones that we kind of know of, or, the ransomware groups. They're really, those quicker actions. So I think it's really interesting to see how we have to understand where the threat is, who that big threat is, and what is their motivation, and why they are trying to do what they're doing and when they want to do it, And so I think for cyber defenders, it's always like, man, what's going to punch us in the nose next?
But I think that's the whole reason why I think there's a leap coming. Technology has evolved to the point to where now we are having these different AI models and everything else to help organizations to be able to protect their infrastructure. I think is going to be pretty fascinating to follow and see how these things go, because with the integration of different so you have SIEM that runs around and is aggregating all these logs and all these incidents from all these different sources and being able to triage those quickly and efficiently, and to be able to tune the system to your specific organization and what the traffic and protocols you have traversing your networks is going to be paramount. Because like I said, I think that we're in an interesting spot right now, and I'm dying to see where we go with the AI here forward, especially to help the defender, right? Because like you just said, playing whack-a-mole, I mean, your job is to share data and to communicate with external sources. They're going to always be a way into your network. It's just a matter of how you mitigate those, and you're placing control measures in place to be able to monitor those connections for abuse is what's going to be the difference.
As always, it's a pleasure talking with you and being able to pick your brain and talk to you about this stuff. So, I appreciate you taking the time, and I like seeing your mindset versus my mindset, because I always come away saying, man, I didn't think about it that way.
Well, neither did I 10 years ago. So like I said, it's one of those things that it evolves over time. And yes, definitely, it's definitely nice to see it from a different perspective. Yes.